Okay, thank you everybody for joining us today. This is a very exciting moment for us. As many of you know, this is our second annual research that we have done with Wakefield Research, studying the impact that poor supplier data can have on supply chain. We're really especially excited to present this one because the first time that we performed this research, it was a couple of weeks before COVID hit. And as we all know, there was a large disruption that happened, and primarily our space was affected. And so when we reran this study this year, we have a lot of before and after comparisons. So this series will be released in 3 different parts. The first airing today on April 7th, the second next week on April 14th, and the third and final part on April 21st. Today, we'll be talking about primarily the supplier data problem during the pandemic. This week, I am our moderator. My name is Matt Palagdary. I am our Chief Strategy Officer at Tealbook, and I'm being joined by Stephanie LaPierre, the founder and CEO of Tealbook, who has really been pioneering the charge on supplier data for the last 15 years. And Nathan Richter, who is a senior partner at Wakefield Research, who has had his research presented in many Fortune really large publications, including the New York Times, USA Today, the Wall Street Journal, NPR, Fox News, the Washington Post, Forbes, and more. Thank you both for joining me.
Thank you, Matt.
We're looking forward to this.
So first, I want to dive a little bit into just the research, and then we'll pass it over to Nathan. But the research was done surveying over 250 CPOs, and they were asked on the state of procurement, and specifically around the burden that COVID-19 placed on procurement leaders. And so the first point that we want to make here is that back in March of 2020, 81% of our procurement leaders conveyed that they were not completely confident in their supplier data. It was not a surprise then that when COVID happened, that an overwhelming 82% of procurement leaders discovered that their supply chain was not completely adequate to get them through the pandemic. So Nathan, I want to start with you. Can we pass it over to you? And can you give us some insight into the actual research behind the data?
Sure, happy to. And thank you again, Matt. Thank you, Stephanie. Thanks to everyone attending. It's great to be with you today. So, first, just to open the aperture a little bit, when we work in verticals like this, when we do market research, we explore a huge variety of topics, and some more timely than others. So when we first began working with Tealbook in I think it was March of 2020, it was the very opening days of the pandemic, and little did we know that supply chains would become one of the hottest topics around. We knew they were important. Naturally, they're important to everybody on this call or in this webinar, but sort of the pandemic made supply chains a conversation, not just for for boardroom tables, but for the dinner table. And so that was an interesting time to start this work with Tealbook, and it was really sort of lightning in a bottle. The research returned a lot of interesting insights. Matt, in particular, you flagged that 81% of procurement and sourcing executives, they had doubts. They weren't confident in their supplier data. And what procurement leaders knew then, and they knew it unequivocally, was that this was a vulnerability. And that vulnerability was then later revealed in a big way as the pandemic unfolded. And so, for this year, we wanted to know the next chapter in the story. We were extremely pleased when Tealbook sort of further demonstrated their commitment to this industry and to learning more, and approached Wakefield again to learn what procurement leaders were feeling, sort of if not on the other side of the pandemic, closer to the other side, we hope. And this research was very robust for the sector. It surveyed 200 procurement and sourcing executives, director level or higher, at rather large organizations, companies with $200 million or more in annual revenue. And it found sort of the bookend to the previous stat. It found that 82% said their data came up short during the pandemic, that they were not completely confident in it. And so, Matt, really, as you can see, a year later, and those issues with supplier data remain.
Well, and Stephanie, I'm keen to hear your perspective on this. Obviously, you've been dealing with supplier data for some time. I'm assuming that this doesn't shock you that supplier data was not able to get most organizations through the pandemic.
No, I mean, we've been advocating for having better quality and visibility for a long time. And so obviously we didn't anticipate that a global pandemic would increase the awareness of this gap. Even before COVID, I was speaking at a conference asking CPOs of some of the largest companies in the world to raise their hands if they had confidence in the quality and the completeness of their supplier data. And everyone laughed, right? There was this sort of smile of like, that's funny because we all know it's a problem, but we don't have a solution for it. And then I would ask, raise your hand if you believe that good quality and complete supplier data, not necessarily transactional, even spend data, but the completeness of the information you need to know about who you do business with, how much do you need that in order to enable or achieve digital procurement success? And everyone raised their hands. And it sort of landed itself really well because it shows that we have a big data problem. We have a big data gap. And what we saw in the research last year was that 93, I believe, % of supply chain and procurement executives were experiencing negative impact to their business on a regular basis. And we're talking about financial loss, delayed timelines, even termination of relationship with suppliers, unhappy internal and external customers. So it was a problem before COVID. I think what COVID did is, the speed that was required to respond, you're on both sides of the spectrum, that you were impacted negatively and you needed to pull back spend and, retract contract or identify opportunities to delay payments, or you're on the upside, or you're looking for to shift your production to make PPEs. You're now sourcing for things you never sourced before, or you're having huge impact on your supply chain and you need to find other suppliers that have the capacity. And it's that lack of visibility to even look in your existing supplier base, to not be able to tap into suppliers that may already be under contract. You just may not know that they could actually have been, able to ensure business continuity, because you just don't have that visibility. So a lot of procurement teams, supply chain, reaching out, externally to look for suppliers, even that's hard because there's so much competition for some of these goods and services or materials that were required, very quickly.
Yeah, and that's very interesting. And I think it brings us to the next point that, in my perspective, I found this one of the most shocking, that throughout this survey, more than 96% of respondents said that being agile is now more important than driving cost savings to the company, with 42% feeling strongly that this is the case. And so is this something that you predicted a while ago, Steph? Is this something that you saw coming?
I always see, spend is one area that's been, a core focus. I would say even procurement has built a construct of its metrics based on spend data, because it's been driven by savings. And when you shift from spend to the supplier and all the requirements of those suppliers across all the different functions, you're now tapping into, the opportunity to do more spend optimization or supplier optimization. And when I think of agility, is the opportunity to respond to market changes and the demands of the business, no matter what those requirements may be, and based and prioritize on the goals of the organization. And that may be savings. It could also be access to innovation, right? So, and it could be a more focus on risk mitigation. And we get a lot, we'll talk about ESG, but I think it's the ability to adapt and meet the business requirements at a speed that the business needs it to remain competitive. And I think, to me, at least, savings is just part of that agility. It should not be the core focus, because the incremental gain from procurement long-term on savings, yes, it should be included, but it can drive so much more value to the organization. And so it should be incorporated as part of those metrics versus as being the metrics, the actual metric.
Well, and this is a pretty profound shift for the industry then, because at least in my experience, I've seen business cases being built for procurement almost entirely based on cost savings. We've seen CFOs often funding digital transformations on the premise of having more spend under control or spend under management. how do you think that this shift will affect us going forward? And do you think that supply chain transformations need to be reshifted and thought about being agile first?
Yeah, I mean, I'm having more and more conversations with executive outside of procurement. And I think it's not, the timing is that the executive team are more acutely aware of the gaps that was happening in supply chain. And they're starting to really want to understand information beyond the spend line items. How can we drive more value? How can supply chain actually help us be more competitive? And procurement has a big role to play in this. And so I do think it's going to shift. I do think that procurement now is under, I would say, yeah, it's probably pressure, right? There's an expectation that, the executive suite, the board, investors are looking at this function to be able to help the organization be more competitive, be more innovative, meet requirements that are imposed on them or that are giving them a competitive advantage. And that shift is, again, if you can meet savings target, but more of a spend optimization, save where it makes sense, but there's other areas where savings does not contribute to acceleration and innovation and competitiveness. You need to be able to have visibility across the entire spectrum and be able to articulate and track progress and be able to report that progress. That's where procurement will tap into true value to the organization.
Well, I'm sure we will come back to this topic, but I want to shift to the next slide here, because this is really just the tip of the iceberg as some of the core findings come back. Before we dive into the real meat of why some of these findings are impactful for our space, Nathan, I want to turn it back over to you. Is there anything additionally that you can provide here on some insight into the core research that went into some of these findings?
Yeah, happy to, Matt. And I just want to go back to the point about agility just for a moment, because I think it's so important to the larger study. It's so important to this larger conversation. As part of this research, we're looking into how procurement leaders feel about everything from what went wrong to, during COVID-19, the lessons they've learned, and how well positioned they are to act on those lessons. And so in that context, when you look at that stat that Stephanie mentioned, that 96% say that agility is more important than cost savings to the bottom line, when we open the scope and look at the rest of the findings, what we see is an extreme sense of vulnerability and nervousness. If you can just consider this for a minute, even a year in to this crisis, 32% of our procurement executives feel very prepared for another supplier disruption in the coming 6 months. So what that really means is, if you look at the inverse of that, 68% are nervous about another disruption. They don't feel that they're on a sound footing. And so, that's sort of the old trade-off, right? Are people going to be penny wise or at the expense of being pound foolish? And the research shows that procurement leaders are looking to avoid that mistake. As we look deeper at the kind of value of agility, the research shows that these executives are still feeling flat-footed. 72% are concerned that supplier intel has not significantly improved since the beginning of the pandemic. And this is in despite of, or maybe even because 73% have not yet made improvements necessary to future-proof supply chains. That's a huge number, and as such, that's a huge vulnerability. It's probably not for a lack of effort or will. Everyone wants to do the right thing, and the research does paint a picture of procurement leaders doing the best they can. But in a situation where 57% rely on, as you see in the slide there, rely on manual entry to update their data, and where 35% are sometimes doing that themselves. You can see the challenges to meet the required standard are significant. This probably also explains in part why procurement leaders report sort of a high investment of time and money into every supplier record, which they estimate the cost at just around $2,400. I think that the figure is $2,431, I believe. And so it represents a huge investment of time and money. And as researchers, when we look at a metric like that, we're not really looking specifically at, is it 2,400 or 2,300? What we're looking at is the size, the scale, and the scope of the perceived investment. Because this is an abstract idea, sort of what is the total amount of money it costs per record. So for respondents to report back that it's around $2,400 per record, what they're saying is there's an incredible amount of value invested into this. And so taken as a whole, what we see here, Matt, and Stephanie, is that procurement leaders, I think they feel trapped with the worst of both worlds. They're expending a lot of effort, they're doing their best, and yet they're still feeling vulnerable.
Well, and that's very interesting, Nathan. I want to touch a little bit on multiple topics on this slide here, but $2,431 per supply record is a massive investment. And looking over here at the middle bullet, with 72% of respondents saying they're still concerned about the status of their company supplier data. Stephanie, how do you interpret this data, and should customers be more alarmed?
I think so. I mean, I think it's not, as Nathan mentioned, it's not by lack of effort. I think data has traditionally been incredibly difficult to harness and to improve the quality of the data for a period of time. And so if you look at the history of how customers have tackled data, it's been mostly through services, software, people, high dependency on suppliers to come to portal to maintain information. And we know that there's a burden of portals, and suppliers are not necessarily always motivated at scale to maintain information. And so when that question to CPO, raise your hand if you have some confidence in the quality and the completeness of your data, and people laugh, it's not because they're not aware. They all know that they have a data problem. They just don't know how to fix it, because traditionally it's been so difficult. And we've had this mentality of going to technology first, like buying software as a means to digitize the procurement function. And it was a bit of a false promise. Like, I'm going to move to cloud technologies. And we've seen this in other sectors like Salesforce, right? Moving to cloud technology to have a unified view of your customer did not guarantee good data unless you had people maintaining that information in a software. And unfortunately, people are not overly reliable, or they have just the information that they know. And so you've seen companies in the sales side and marketing coming out with ways to proactively enhance information and feed that into Salesforce, so you have a much more scalable, automated way to bring information to life. And that's really, I think, when we're looking at the future, and if you're familiar with Dr. Epstein's ecosystem chart that she published recently, she calls it the hub, is moving towards a less technology dependent infrastructure, because when you're depending on software, one, the data gets stale fairly quickly. It requires an enormous amount of integration between systems, and we know that causes budget creep, and it continuously changes. And it also locks you into software when there's a pretty dynamic ecosystem of software right now that are doing very niche. They're providing niche solution in areas that really meets the digital requirements of different areas of the organization. But when you're putting all these systems together today, and the infrastructure that most procurement functions have, it creates a lot of disparity across these systems, a lot of siloed. And if you're not easily able to connect all this information, to unify it, bring connectivities, that's really where the mature organization, their digital transformation, are now scratching their head. They've invested so much in technology, yet they still don't have access to good supplier data. And that paralyzes a lot of the decisions, and it creates inability to be more proactive, more predictive, and creating value for the organization. Now think of a company, and we talk about manual data entry, of companies who are in pre-transformation or still very early stage, who don't have technologies. They're believing that technology is going to solve their data problem, so they're making that investment, not thinking about the data up front. If they're earlier than that, they're probably doing a lot of manual work, which again, the scale is just not sustainable, especially in an environment where there's so much changes happening. A lot more requirements are put on organization around, executive order, reshoring, again, ESG, diversity requirements, compliance and risk. Like there's so much more happening so fast that humans and software and services just can't keep up. So I think it has to, for the industry to think differently, changing its mindset around, having a data first approach, and then, looking for solutions that can easily be bolt onto the technology stack, as opposed to trying to figure out how to build this or continue doing this the wrong way.
Yeah, and I want to touch on one of the topics that you mentioned there, and in some ways I'm going to press a little bit. Do you think we're being a little bit too generous to organizations by saying that we think that they're giving it a try? I actually heard both you, Stephanie, and you, Nathan, say that it's probably not due a lack of trying. But when I read of what's on this slide here, 72% are concerned that their company's supplier intel is not significantly improved, but then 3 out of 4, 73% have not made the necessary improvements to future-proof their supply chains. And do we think that this really needs to be pressed on? Because I get a little bit of a sentiment that there is this free pass of skating by the investment. And when we look to the right, that $2,431 per supplier record, the impacts can be significantly massive within an organization. So can I pass it back to you, Stefan? Do you mind touching on that?
Yeah, and then when I'm looking at that 2,431, that's just to maintain like records, right? So, and that's a record. And so not having good data, one, it creates a lot of inefficiencies. There's a cost to maintaining this. And what we've seen in the past is, CPOs saying we need to consolidate our supplier base by 50%. And that's because of the cost of maintaining this information, and the lost opportunities of being able to have economies of scales, or, better negotiated rate and things like that. In a world today where you have so many different requirements, the consolidation of 50% of your supplier base does not make sense anymore. It's having, again, that visibility of your entire supplier base and be able to optimize it appropriately, and not having unnecessary costs added to it. If you're maintaining unnecessary records of suppliers that you don't need, or you've got duplication of records, you're overpaying for things that you don't need to overpay. So thinking about, that type of investment, you are making an investment, but kind of in the wrong way, because it still doesn't result in you having good data quality. And so again, looking at ways to automate, looking for solutions that can provide automation that are not hard to implement. I was with a company yesterday saying, we have a challenge because no one owns how it ties all together. We need better data. We need the data to be integrated into our systems and our people, but no one in the organization has the vision of how this ties in. And I think it's the CPO's vision, or the CPO needs to own that vision of how this all ties in together. What is the current investment today? What is the cost avoidance of having better data quality? And I think they would fall on their back. It would be, millions and millions or hundreds of millions of dollars in ROI, both on the top line and bottom line. Plus the benefit of, again, meeting board requirements and building more trusted, loyal relationship with suppliers and consumers.
So the last point that we'll touch on here, there are a lot more key findings we want to get to. But one thing we haven't talked about yet is that in the far right column, in the calculation of the cost per record, actually a third of procurement leaders responded that they have no way of actually knowing how much this record costs. And given how large that number can potentially be, that I find that rather shocking. And so, Steph, I want to pass it over to you. You've been looking at this for a very long time. Does that shock you that over a third of respondents are responding in a way that they actually have no idea how much it's costing the organization?
I'm not shocked at all. This was much higher than I thought, which is maybe the shocking piece of it. I think I had heard data because we were trying to find a way to build ROI for our customers of what's the value of having better information without having to build the infrastructure to collect this data manually. And we were in the $500 per record. So this is actually quite significantly higher. And if you're thinking you've got 10 25, 30, 100,000 suppliers. We're talking about a massive investment being made, still not resulting in better data quality. And I think that's what you got to pause and think about this, right? Is there a better way to be able to get better data quality at a much lower cost per record? That should be the 2021 objective. And then, I think just looking at all the pieces that touches a record, I think it would actually be, it's almost overwhelming to be able to capture how this is being calculated and what's the actual cost. I'm actually surprised so many understand the cost or have a good sense of it. So definitely not shocked that procurement teams would know how to calculate, but they should know, and they should be aiming to reduce that cost and tie it back to ROI.
Well, I have a feeling we're going to come back to this because I do see some questions coming in on the topic. I want to advance a little bit here because there are more key findings. But when I look at kind of the next realm of the questions here, we've seen this additional wave towards a focus on ESG for most organizations. Yet 63% of the respondents still said they lack full visibility into the supplier data to fulfill this mandate. And so, Nathan, I want to chime back over to you from a data perspective. What insights did you gather in some of these key findings?
Yeah, thank you, Matt, and happy to speak on that a little bit. So, and really, this circles back to a little bit about what Stephanie was saying a moment ago. That despite the just enormous cost and effort going into these records, these procurement leaders they still feel like the data they have is insufficient. And the data point on ESG mandates is an excellent piece of evidence in that direction. Where at a point where you have a clear majority, 63%. Saying that they lack visibility into the supplier data needed to meet those ESG mandates, that's an issue. And it's an issue because we know from research conducted with Tealbook in that first wave at the very top of, we'll call it pre-pandemic, but it was pre-pandemic by about a week. That what happens when there is poor visibility into supplier data. Procurement leaders cited delays in projects. I think about half, just shy of half, cited that as an issue. Delays in payments, again, about half cited that as an issue. And missed deadlines, so slightly fewer, around 40% cited that as an issue. So poor visibility has real consequences for business, and those consequences continue to be felt. And that's just one of several concerns that were surfaced through the research. You see here, 74% of our procurement leaders are concerned that they're unable to leverage supplier relationships to drive innovation. And so there's a concern about sort of the records that they have and the amount of time and money required to maintain them. There's also sort of, what do you do with that information once you have it? And so that 3/4 are concerned that they're unable to leverage supplier relationships to drive innovation is extremely notable. Why is this, right? Well, we found that about half say it's because they're still playing catch up due to delays caused by COVID-19, and that's completely understandable. The pandemic will continue to cast a long shadow. Matt, I appreciate your comment previously that said, we're giving these people a pass. I don't mean to give them a pass, but it's been a year for everybody, including our procurement leaders. So the fact that the delays caused by COVID are still felt, I think, is realistic. But another third, say that they're unable to leverage those relationships because there's a lack of corporate initiative to do so, and that's different. Where we're talking about the will to do so. As many, about a third, said it was because they're too committed to existing suppliers and processes. So sort of a bit of inertia at play. So both of those factors highlight that even outside the causes related to the pandemic and to COVID, the lack of agility is an obstacle, and you can't blame the pandemic for that inertia. I think that lack of agility is likely why, when asked about their top concerns related to not having high quality supplier data, sort of missing out on innovation was the number one response. There were a lot of concerns there, but that was the number one. About a third called that the top issue. And there were plenty more things to worry about. Other top concerns were things like compromising the integrity of IT solutions, or falling behind the competition, or or not being able to assess supplier diversity, and crucially, we think not being able to determine ROI, where a quarter of respondents cited that. So there's a really wide range here. And the takeaway for us is, fortunately, there's space for organizations to overcome these problems. Some progress is being made. We see it in how procurement leaders view their indirect procurement processes, for example, where 92% report becoming more strategic in their indirect procurement as a result of COVID-19. So there's perhaps a silver lining. So in sum, as you can see, Matt, the procurement leaders' concerns, they really highlight that there's a lot of room left for improvement, and by addressing these issues, organizations will hopefully find themselves on a little bit more solid ground.
Well, thanks a lot, Nathan. There's a lot to digest in there. And so, Stephanie, I'm going to go one by one here to get your perspective from a thought leadership side here. The first point was that 63% lack full visibility into their ESG. And so how often do you see ESG coming up in discussions today? Do you see kind of an increase or decrease? And what kind of impact do you think correcting the data can have on an organization that does have ESG related focus?
Yeah, I mean, ESG, I think ESG it's been there, obviously talking about sustainability, it's been there. There's been requirements for it, but it feels to me in the past month and a half that I'm hearing it from all sides. I've been on panels, I've been hearing it at most meetings where we're talking about vision and use cases and requirements. I was on a women and fund financing panel with funds that are dedicated capital to invest in organizations that have social impact, and they're asking those organizations to provide a baseline for ESG, track progress, and be able to report this information. And there's a lot of fluidity, I think, in ESG still. So for organizations that are pretty immature in ESG, I think it's starting, where do you start? And then it's a part of that is understanding your supply base, having visibility to who are your suppliers, what ESG requirements they may be meeting. Identify within your even vendor master, what are suppliers that potentially could meet those ESG requirements, but maybe they're not certified for certain things that you can report on them. Having that visibility gives you the opportunity to have a baseline, gives you the opportunity to identify what you're going to be reporting, what are your goals, and then start having access to the information to not only access those suppliers, but be able to track progress and report that in real time. And we're talking about board level requirements, which when we're talking about ROI and our team, having that real-time reporting at a board meeting to show not only your ESG baseline, your goals, and the progress towards that goal, I'd say it's priceless because this is touching every part of the organization and at a board level and at their typically a shareholder level. So if procurement has an opportunity to be that value add, to be that driver of helping the organization meet these ESG requirements, not only it's good to attract capital, maintain capital, but also build competitiveness, because more and more organizations that are putting these big commitments are asking their suppliers and their partners to have very similar requirements. So starting early, but without having quality data, you're building an infrastructure again where you're going to collect this information through software and services. It's going to be expensive, it's going to take time, and you're most likely not going to capture 100% of those suppliers who meet the requirements, or be able to have visibility to work with those suppliers towards getting those requirements in place.
Well, it seems like a lot of some of the reasons behind the lack of data may also touch on the next topic here, and the ability to take advantage of supplier innovation. I've been at a number of conferences over the last several years, and supply side innovation seems to be a core topic at many of them. And so I was a little shocked to see here that 3 out of 4 procurement leaders say that they're actually concerned that they're not in a position to leverage supplier relationships to drive innovation. And in a world where the most innovative company usually wins, I can see why 21% of those are actually extremely concerned. So Steph, I'd be really curious on your thoughts here and how much supplier data is actually a core inhibitor of taking advantage of supply side innovation.
Yeah, it's huge. Again, it's having an understanding of who your suppliers are at 100%. So even if suppliers you're spending $1,000 with today, there's potentially a very strong pool of companies in there that could drive innovation for the company. I believe the supply base is the biggest untapped asset for an organization. And if you don't have that data and you can optimize it, you're missing a huge opportunity. So again, turning the light on to your supplier base, have the capacity to leverage it. When we also talk about innovation, supplier diversity come to mind. And I can talk to one of our customer who had a significant portion of their spend was with potential small and diverse businesses. So these were not certified small and diverse businesses, but they look like they met the requirements, and be able to have visibility to those suppliers is huge, because it gives you the opportunity to significantly improve your diversity spend. But mostly for this client, that they wanted to lower the bar for those suppliers to get certified, because they want to start driving a pipeline of companies that could drive innovation for the organization and help them be the market leader. Again, it comes back for having this data, having the opportunity to outreach to those suppliers. What we built in Tealbook to solve for this is a self-certification process that's been authenticated and approved by the VA and the SBA, and is being recognized by our clients, being sensitive that not all companies would recognize a self-certification. But even if you don't recognize it, it's still a pretty good indicator that those suppliers who go through that 20-minute free process to get certified would most likely be motivated to get certified appropriately, and you recognizing them. So when you're looking at the incentive, I can report my small and diverse suppliers who are the key driver typically for innovation. I can only report the ones that are certified. That's where my motivation is going to be. Meanwhile, a shocking fact is that only 5% of businesses that meet those small and diversity requirements are in fact certified. So we're talking about 95% of businesses that meet small and diversity requirements are not certified and not being recognized by the organizations to report in their small and diversity spend. So you're talking about big companies right now making these big commitments to small, diverse businesses, also with a lens on innovation, but they're missing a huge untapped, opportunity to drive a lot more innovation in a pipeline of those organizations to help them drive, again, to help them be the market leader and help stay on top of competition.
Well, and I think that actually leads pretty well into the last point here, which is maybe a bullet that I personally am not shocked of. This is the first time that I've seen procurement really in the news as much as it has been. But 92% of respondents said that they think procurement has become more strategic in the long run because of COVID-19. Steph, can you touch on this? Is it shocking to you? And where do you think that this will head over time?
I think, as Nathan mentioned, right, it's very encouraging that we have so much opportunity for improvement, and we can make such a difference and an impact. And I think procurement, in some ways, yes, the function has been, completely turned upside down in the past 12 months, but to be recognized now by CEOs, by COOs, by CFOs as being more strategic and driving more value to the organization, and not looking at it from more of a sort of a support role that's, cost savings or the police of spend. I think it's a huge leg up on the function. And we're seeing teams that are shifting now, even in the talent and how they're looking at building their transformation to be a lot more enabling, a lot more strategic, and building a function that is allowing, that's considering all the digital requirements, that's considering all the different functions, that's pulling data across all these functions, and helping people on the front line, employees, do their job faster and better, while keeping the company in a good cash position, out of the the front page of the newspapers, and satisfying all of their requirements. So procurement has a huge opportunity right now. Again, to me, it's all tying back to data. Everything we do in procurement is around collecting information. We've done that through processes and software. And if we can be more data minded and build a culture that's really defined and insight, then you need to have a data foundation. You need to have visibility into that data so that you can support that culture, and you can start making decisions with information that's quality, and report metrics that people will buy into and see the value of procurement for what it is.
Well, that is very insightful, and I did a quick time check here, so I do want to move on to the next section of our presentation here, which is more the Q&A section. Before we actually do that, though, I want to remind everybody listening in today that the webinar today will be published to our YouTube channel, so you will be able to go find that in case you missed anything, and then to remind everybody to submit your questions in case you have any pressing at this moment. So before we move into the question and answer section, Steph or Nathan, do you have any final thoughts that you want to have before we skew them with the questions from the audience?
For our part, just again, thank you everyone for your attention to this this issue, this research. Thank you to Tealbook for really in a very tangible way demonstrating their commitment to helping folks improve their work in this space. And we look forward to the other two webinars. And other than that, just have a great day.
Yeah, thank you, Nathan and Wakefield, for working with us. I think this has been so insightful, and we're going to continue doing this study so that we can see the progress being made over time. We do, I believe, have a white paper that's being published as well, so you'll be able to access that information. This is a great use case if you're looking, if you believe, and obviously if you're here, you're looking at your strategy, you're looking at how data plays in that strategy, you're trying to understand how to build a data foundation, or how to think about integrating data as part of your digital transformation. This is, I think that the information from Wakefield is great to build that business case to the organization and start identifying ROI opportunities to build that investment. I think to think about this investment is, from a data perspective, there is an investment there, but you can see just in supplier record, which is a tiny little piece of all the opportunities, is a great concrete metrics that you can leverage. And then think about how you leverage the technology you already invested in by having data to power it, and how much more you can drive value from those systems, and looking at the new systems or the new digital technologies that you may be introducing to the organization. Again, the ROI is endless, but it starts now, right? Organizations are adopting, they're starting to pay attention, they're investing in their supplier data today, and don't fall behind, because it's happening really fast and the world is changing really fast.
Well, Stephanie, on that topic, I think you were reading some of the viewers' minds here. The first question we have for you is actually on this topic. And before I ask it, I want to preview next week, where we actually go much deeper into the financial business side of the equation. So if you are one of the ones asking questions along the business case perspective, make sure you come in next week where we go deeper into this topic. But Steph, a quick question for you on that. So the question is, $2,431 per supplier record seems extremely high. They have about 8,000 vendors, which means managing this data would come to almost $20 million. Do you see business cases being approved with this type of justification?
It should. I mean, I think you could even look at how you deduplicate your records to start with. Even there, you're going to be able to reduce a significant amount of that spend. And then from that point on, how do you reduce that amount from 2,400? I think there's some really easy, quick wins, and certainly our customers are using that now as a data point to build their business case internally to get the investment for Tealbook. So yeah, I mean, it's one metrics. Again, there's others in identifying what is a priority, but this is something that is research based, right? It's coming from Wakefield. This is something that you have the data to back it up with. This is not something you've made up or read, and it's just an article. It's has a lot of credibility behind it.
And Nathan, maybe I'll pan over to you if it's okay. Do you mind reminding the viewers what actually went into that metric of the $2,431 per supplier record?
Sure. So happy to. So as described earlier, when we return a data point like that, we're not asking folks to sit down and do a multivariable complicated assessment on the back of a napkin on the cost per record. What it is it's saying, in the context of your experience as a senior level procurement professional, taking into consideration all the factors, what do you think the cost is? And so when they give you that number, they're not telling you it's $2,400 versus $2,300. versus $2,500. That's not really the point. The point is the scale of that figure. Is it $50? Is it $5,000? Is it somewhere in between? And so what, as researchers, when we see a metric like this, what it's telling us is it's a big number. And it represents a significant investment on behalf of these organizations. So that's how one reads a metric like that. That's the purpose of such a metric in the context of this kind of research.
What I would add to this is last year when the Wakefield Research came up, we got a ton of media attention. And I think the reporters were shocked by the numbers and how widespread this was. This touches every single organization in any sector, any geography. If you're working with suppliers, which is the majority of enterprise who spend a certain amount, even we're spending quite a bit with suppliers now, but as soon as you start to get into thousands of suppliers, the inefficiencies today of having, of collecting this information, maintaining it, meeting different requirements across different portals and systems and businesses just creates a lot of disparity, makes it incredibly challenging. And so thinking about, how do you think about, collecting, aggregating, unifying this information differently is a huge bonus. And then putting a metric like this, just to even give you guidance of the type of savings up front of the short-term wins you can have is quite powerful.
Well, so we do have the next session entirely on this, so we hope to get deeper at that time. There is a question based on some of the material from today, and that is specifically around the question where 96% of procurement leaders now agree that the shift towards being agile is more important than cost savings. And the question is really, how do we judge procurement success under such a model? And I'll add to maybe what the question is. I think that it's more around we're used to such a model where it's purely based on driving savings to the bottom line and being able to control spend under management. In the agile way, how do we actually determine whether the organization is successful or not?
It's a really hard answer to give because it depends on what the organization is looking to achieve, right? So speed is one, access to innovation and how that translates into top line revenue, or the speed of how that impacts top line revenue. It could be the access to information that helps you meet some certain requirements. Like, again, there's so many, I'd say there's hundreds, if not thousands of use cases that come out once you have visibility into your supplier data and you have the opportunity to take action on it. So I'd say what's most important is defining what agility means to your organization, and then finding tangible ways to be able to measure it. And again, I think there's so many opportunities, it's hard to define today. Even I think savings in some ways has been hard to define. And some savings that's being reported has been debated in the past, but savings is definitely a more concrete metrics than agility. But we hope that with the information coming out, and we're doing some work on establishing what's an agility score and how you can benchmark against that score. It's some of the things that we're looking to help the procurement community with. And Matt, I don't know if you have more insight in what the work that we're doing and what we're hearing from customers.
I think there's a lot of uncertainty in that right now, at least from what I am seeing. And I think that just like some of the other shifts in the procurement world, we don't know what we don't know yet. But I do think that there's going to be a hybrid model of keeping your organization running. There were lots of supply chains that actually had to shut down this year because they didn't have the necessary PPE and things like that, which ultimately makes a much more significant impact to the bottom line than a couple of pennies cost saving. So I think that we're going to shift to a little bit of a model that will judge the core savings from a spend under management perspective, while also keeping the health of the organization, keeping maybe them out of the news. So that's my prediction. I don't know that, but I think it's the only logical way we can go. But Steph, we actually have two questions here that I think are really prime for you to answer, and they're both based on digital transformation sophistication. So the first comes from a company that seems to be early in their transformation. So the question is, we fall into the 63% of companies that lack full visibility into ESG practices, but we have a hard time even knowing what standards to adhere to Do you have any advice for a company like us early in our transformation journey?
Yeah, and I think if you're early in your transformation journey, I think it's good to establish that ESG is a core requirements for the executive team. So it has to be a priority. And then, I mean, we certainly can help. We do have ESG certifications and baseline in Tealbook, just as we offer for supplier diversity. And so we can definitely help with the baseline. We can help certainly with some of the requirements that you need to report on. We don't have them all because ESG, there's 14 requirements. It's not just all related to suppliers, but the ones that you're focused on suppliers is be able to, again, give you the data, give you access to those suppliers, give you the pipeline of potential. That's a really good way to start. And it doesn't need to be complicated. And when you're in pre-transformation, I think most pre-transformation customers would apologize. They feel like they're so far behind and they haven't yet invested in technology. They almost feel embarrassed about this. And I think you're the lucky ones, actually. I think you have not made bad investments yet. You don't have to live with those decisions because there's so much investment that have been made on those systems. And you have a chance to now start with turning the data onto your supplier base, understanding your ecosystem, building your strategy on that information. You're able to roll out applications that are very easy to use to start driving some changes to some of the processes that you're looking to establish, having really quick win. And what we've seen in our customers certainly is when they have quick win in a digital transformation, one, it energizes everyone, but it also starts giving you the investment thesis, the business case to continue to invest and buy eventually technology, because you would be looking to have more robust source to pay or sourcing solutions or contract management solution. But instead of looking at it from all disparate solutions with different portals, with different data stack in each of those systems, you have a chance now to start improving the quality of your data with building a data foundation, bring visibility. You're able to drive those changes, get those ROIs. And when you're ready to buy technology, you can just connect it to your data foundation and power those systems with better quality data. The uptime of those systems is much faster. It covers 100% of your suppliers and maintain it autonomously. And it reduces the dependency on suppliers to come to multiple portals. So it's a huge win, and you can spiral digital transformation much, much faster than what it's been done previously.
Well, and on that lens, we have time for one more question. And I'm going to ask this question, but I'm going to add more context, at least what I think the context is. So let's assume that this person answering or asking the question falls into the category of respondents that are collecting data through manual means today. But the question is, what is the easiest change we can make to our existing procurement strategy when implementing a new data strategy?
Yeah, get the data. not in a way that, you just buy a list and you see your data and then the data decays tomorrow. I think it's looking at what's important to the organization with the data. What are you driving towards? What vision have you set for the organization? And I love where we start to talk with our clients about, it's almost like a special project, like improving the quality and the access to supplier data across all your system. It's a big thing. But it doesn't need to be complicated, and you can stage it in a way that it grows with the organization, it grows with your digital transformation. But I'd say, if you can turn the light on to your vendor masters, see the things that you couldn't see before, you're going to have some really, really quick win. An example of one of our clients who, upon just activating their vendor master, they were able to deduplicate a significant amount of suppliers. They were able to see that they had 30 different contracts with the same suppliers, but their business was so disparate across so many different functions and systems that they knew that they had multiple contracts. They just didn't know how many. Right there and then they were able to renegotiate a blank MSA and negotiate pricing, and that was millions of dollars in savings. They got their baseline for supplier diversity, which they were able to hand to the CEO, and the CEO was able to start talking to the board about their diversity target. That gave them also an opportunity to report that their diversity data to customers or prospect customers, giving them a competitive advantage. Right? So there's so many things that you can do, and you can start now. And I think we've seen in more mature organization, perhaps. And I think consulting business tend to also talk this way, is you need to build your data lake. You need to hire your analyst, and you need to hire data scientists. And I would beg you not to do that because I think, the investment to be made in creating this internally, you're still going to be limited to what you know. And there are technologies that it's Tealbook, or eventually there'll be others that are tackling a similar issue, is that you have the benefit of the investment made in machine learning, the data platform who's secure, who's gone through SOC 2 and test penetration, who can be connected to your vendor master, connected to your system, and you don't have to go through the investment and trying to figure out on your own. Plus, you'll get the external perspective and the aggregated data that will just continue giving insight over time. So again, I'm biased in that statement, but there are solutions today that you can implement, and it doesn't have to be hard. It's a great way to kick off a digital transformation.
Well, thanks for that response there, Steph, and thank you everyone on the line for joining us today. I want to remind everyone that we have part 2 of this series coming next week on Wednesday, April 14th. We do go much deeper into the financial side of the equation and the data. Stephanie will not be joining us, but Kate Hands, our VP of Success, will be joining us, and Nathan will be joining us next week as well. So we hope everybody can join us then. Until then, have a great week.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Nathan, Matt.
Appreciate it, Stephanie.